We have some really good friends in Ballarat who over the years have really become more like family than friends. And I've known Heather since I was 11 or 12, and so it's been some years now that we've been really good friends. Heather has 3 children, and as those children were growing up and as our boys came along, we would regularly go down and have weekends in Ballarat with this family. And it's Auntie Heather. It's just, one of those really great friendships. When the youngest daughter was just a little girl, we would put her to bed. Heather would put her little daughter to bed, and 10 or 15 minutes later, we would repeatedly hear from her bedroom, "Mum, I need ya!" In Psalm 4, verse 1, the psalmist says, paraphrased, "Hear me, Lord, please listen, I need some help down here." There will be few of us that have never been in a position that we have not echoed those words. Have you at any time felt like yelling, "God, I need ya"? I think if we're honest, we've all been there at some time or other. And I can remember being 8 months pregnant, Duncan having been retrenched from his job, 2 children and 1 on the way. I was certainly calling out, "God, I need you." I've often wondered if my life is busier than my mum's or my nana's was. It seems so to me. The world has certainly changed so much, and the stress of life seems more prevalent in these days than in previous generations. I seem to have a faster paced life. More seems expected of me. I'm not sure if that's what I see and experience or whether it's actually true, but the amount of people I talk to who are stressed, distressed or depressed is ever increasing. Add to that, in these days, amid COVID-19 restrictions, fears and a somewhat unknown future, and add into that what we've seen coming out of America this week. On the other hand, nothing is new. David, the author of our psalm today, had much in his life that stressed, distressed and depressed him. In David, we see a man who was shaped and strengthened by the stresses in his life. A man that God was able to use because he became both functional and strong enough through or despite those stresses to handle the job God had chosen for him to do. And the best thing about that is that that's not how David began, functional and strong. He began in a place where we often find ourselves. He was not always sure of himself. Sometimes he was unable to make good decisions and good choices. He knew too what it felt like to be stressed. I find that really, really encouraging and comforting that David is just like you and just like me, no more and no less special than I am than you are. When we place ourselves in the hands of a known God, we are changed. And if there's anything in life that causes us to change, it's times of trouble and it's times of stress. When our lives, our faith is under pressure, it's then that we display who we really are. It's not the problem that's the problem, it's the way we react to the problem. That's the problem. Perhaps what I'd like you to grasp today is not so much the stresses, the trials, etc., although they are important, but it's what we do under those pressures in the face of fire that matters. I recall Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. They face a fire that had been turned up 7 times hotter than normal. Who did these guys look to in the fiery trials of their life? Were certainly not the trouble or the fire, but to their God, their known God. And who showed up in the middle of the fire? God. It's an amazing story. But what is even more amazing is actually the end result. Not so much that their lives were spared in the 7 times hotter than fire, not one hair on their heads was even singed, but the amazing thing is this cold-hearted, ruthless, angry king was eventually brought to say, "No other God can save in this way." That's the miraculous thing that happened. Be both assured and warned. that the way we face troubles and trials and the stresses of life have a profound influence on those around us, and whatever our actions are will rub off on those who are watching. Let's follow what David did. He turned to prayer. Psalm 4 tells us this particular moment of David's life. He was stressed. He was under attack on his person, his very character, and his reputation, attacks that had been built on slander and lies. There may be no one here and no one amongst us who is listening that has not at some time or other experienced something of that calibre. We will never completely avoid stress or troubles. We don't always get our own way. People will attack us and they will slander us, and often we can feel completely helpless in such situations. But although we might feel completely helpless, there is little we can do to change or control some situations. What we can do is turn to the one who holds us in those places. David had recognised an important element in his troubles. The troubles and stresses were simply an instrument in God's hands that would enable him to grow, to strengthen him, to mature his faith and trust, and to make him who God wanted him to be. If we look at the trials in that light, as God enabling us to grow, to mature, to strengthen our trust and faith, we will eventually see our troubles as stepping stones rather than perhaps Uluru. There is a saying that says, don't tell God how big your problems are, tell your problems how big your God is. So when we feel overwhelmed, the absolutely best option is to turn to prayer, and in that prayer to be completely honest. God knows how you feel anyway, so voice it. God can take it. God respects and expects us to talk honestly before him. You may not want others to know, but pour it out to a God who knows anyway. It's therapy for your soul. Sometimes what is voiced is not quite so bad when put into verbal words, or even better, write it down. Concentrate on exactly how you feel and write it down. It's a good way to really tell how you are feeling by journaling it. Confusion, worry, fears, praise, adoration, thanks begins with one and ends with the other, just as many of the Psalms do. And it's exactly what David did. He voiced his fears, he voiced his worry and his stress in words. He journaled it. Many of the Psalms are a result of David writing down his thoughts before a holy God. It's okay though, millions of people won't read your journals as we read David's. So as David wrote, he sees God in a different light, and his stress, his pain at what others were doing to him turned into a sense of the strength of God and a stronger trust in who his God is. David was king. Hey, he could have done anything he wanted to rid himself of the very thing, the very people that were causing his pain. Instead, he chose, remember that, he chose to allow God to have his way and instead prayed for those attacking him. Verse 6 indicates that David prayed that God would shine the light of his truth on the situation so that all could see right and wrong. And that's a radically different than our initial human response would be. God calls us to a radically different walk, doesn't he? David's result of the heartfelt declaration of his thoughts was that even while he was still praying, a great gladness and joy was restored to him, indicating two things. David spent significant, purposeful time with God, pouring it out his heart about a situation that he could not change or alter, and he evaluated his thoughts. And secondly, David was willing to allow God to change him, change his reactions, change his thoughts. And this too is incredibly important. Too often we call God to change others, to change the circumstances or situation that we are in, when much of the time God wants us to change. We cannot change any other person, but you can, with God's help, change yourself. When we realize that and when we accept it, God can and will do miracles. It allows him to work, to really work at anything and everything that troubles or stresses us. It relinquishes space for God to work. It creates a deeper trust and faith that God is in control, and releases rest, gladness, gratitude, peace in the midst of turmoil, in the midst of a fire 7 times hotter than normal. David was by no means perfect, and that there is comfort because neither are we. But here's a great example. David in verse 1 recognizes that there is nothing in him that is worthy of God's intervention. For God to answer would be an act of grace, giving David something he didn't deserve. Even so, David called on God, knowing that God was a God of grace. David did as he so often did. He prayed and he trusted, remembering God's righteousness and trusting in God's faithfulness and mercy that answers would come. David turned his eyes and heart and life to God and found comfort from the stresses and trials of life in the loving presence of his Father. So shall we? So can we?